Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level learners of English. What happened to Patrick Zaki? The Egyptian student, researcher, and human rights activist was arrested in Cairo 2 years ago. But why? What did he do? And what will happen to him in the future? Let's talk about it on today's episode of Thinking in English. Check out thinkinginenglish.blog for a full transcript of today's episode, and head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more great English content. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. To interrogate. To interrogate. To ask someone a lot of questions for a long time in order to get information, sometimes using threats or violence. For example, the man was arrested and interrogated for 5 hours. To detain. To detain. To force someone to officially stay in a place, as in, a suspect has been detained by the police for questioning. To drop. To drop. To stop something you were doing or planning to do, as in, the union dropped its demands in return for a pay rise. To marginalise. To marginalise. To treat someone or something as if they are not important, as in, some people are worried that the country's native language will be marginalised. Relentless. Relentless. Continuing in a severe or extreme way. For instance, the relentless heat makes it difficult to work during the day. Arbitrarily. Arbitrarily. In a way that uses personal power unfairly and without considering people's rights and wishes, such as local officials enforce rules arbitrarily and unreasonably. Plight. Plight. An unpleasant condition, especially a serious, sad, or difficult one, as in, he was moved by the plight of the refugees. Honorary. Honorary. Given as a reward without qualifying in a standard way. For example, the university gave the president an honorary degree. Torture. Torture. The act of causing great physical or mental pain in order to persuade someone to do something or to give information. For instance, he revealed his secrets under torture. In February 2020, before the world was turned upside down by COVID-19, Patrick George Zaki was arrested at Cairo airport. The Egyptian postgraduate student was returning to his home country to visit family for a few days. Instead, he was blindfolded, handcuffed, and interrogated at the airport for 17 hours before being taken to a secret National Security Agency building. During the interrogation, he was allegedly threatened, beaten, and tortured with electricity. Officials questioned him about his studies, research, and opinions on human rights. Eventually, he was charged by the police with spreading fake news and supporting unauthorized protests. From the 7th of February 2020 until December 2021, Zaki was detained by the Egyptian government. Although currently released, the charges against Patrick have not been dropped, and he will face trial over the next few months. Today's episode of Thinking in English is going to examine the case of Patrick Zaki in a little more detail. Who is Patrick Zaki? Why was he arrested by the Egyptian security services? What was the international reaction to his detainment? What will happen next? And what does the whole affair tell us about academic freedom in the Middle East? Let's try to answer these questions over the next 10 minutes or so. And I also want to give a big thank you to my Instagram followers, especially Paolo Venezia and Maria Negretti, for suggesting this topic. If you have any topic ideas, message me on Instagram and I might record an episode on the topic as well. Before his arrest and detention, Patrick George Zaki had been working, studying, and researching in the field of human rights and gender. He had been a researcher specializing in gender for a human rights organization called the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, or EIPR. And he was doing a master's degree in women and gender studies at the University of Bologna in Italy. It was during a brief trip home from Italy to visit his family that Zaki was arrested at Cairo airport. The program Zaki was studying in Italy was part of what is known as a Erasmus Mundus master's degree and is organized jointly by 7 different leading universities across Europe. The focus of the degree is in training gender experts who will be able to contribute to gender equality and equity, taking into account ethnicity, race, class, age, sexuality, and contributing to rethink the idea of citizenship. So, in a nutshell, it is a program for students who want to work in human and gender rights. Another relevant factor is Patrick Zaki's religion. Zaki is Coptic Christian, a religious minority that makes up about 10 to 15% of the Egyptian population. Coptic Christians have been marginalised by the Egyptian government, targeted with hate crimes by extremists, and are generally unrepresented or underrepresented in modern Egyptian politics and society. In July 2019, Zaki published an opinion article on the website Daraj titled Displacement, Murder and Narrowing, a week's result in the diaries of Egypt's Copts. His article described his experiences as a Coptic Christian in Egypt and expressed his personal view on the current events and the treatment of religious minorities by the Egyptian government. Although religious freedom is guaranteed by the Constitution of Egypt, and that President El-Sisi has urged civil society to spread awareness of human rights culture and contribute to achieving the aspirations of the Egyptian people, the country has been known to punish people who speak out against the government. International human rights organizations have described the current Egyptian government's policies as a relentless crackdown on any form of dissent. Thousands of government critics, especially human rights workers and journalists, have been arbitrarily detained. As a human rights advocate who had written about the plight of Egypt's Coptic community, Zaki was viewed as an opponent or threat. The day after he was detained at the airport, the security services announced he was being investigated due to terrorism-related activities. Eventually, this charge was changed to spreading false news inside and outside of the country. Spreading fake news can result in 5 years in prison if found guilty. EIPR, the human rights organization Zaki had worked for, has become a common target for government restrictions in Egypt. 3 of their staff were jailed in 2020, with an international and high-profile campaign involving celebrities like Scarlett Johansson helping to secure their release. And the founder of the group, Hossam Bagat, was also fined in a court in November last year for an insulting tweet. For almost 2 years, Zaki was detained by security forces in Egypt. According to numerous human rights organizations, Zaki was tortured and threatened by officials. The accusations against him, ranging from publishing rumors and false news to incitement to commit violence and terrorist crimes, have little or no evidence. Patrick Zaki highlighted an issue sensitive for the government: the plight of Coptic Christians. He is also a human rights advocate from a country that increasingly ignores human rights, especially the right to free speech. Whether or not his article was spreading fake news, his arrest seems to be based around his criticism of the government. Internationally, there has been a significant reaction to Mr. Zaki's imprisonment, especially from Italy. In December 2020, the European Parliament called for the release of Patrick George Zaki. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Scholars at Risk, have all urged the Egyptian government to rethink their actions. And as I mentioned earlier, the Hollywood star Scarlett Johansson was involved in campaigns for the release of Zaki and his colleagues. Patrick Zaki's imprisonment has been a high-profile news story in Italy. In fact, it was my Italian podcast listeners who recommended I look at this topic. In 2016, an Italian PhD student at the University of Cambridge, called Guido Regini, was murdered in Cairo, and the Patrick Zaki affair is bringing back the memories for the Italian people. Italian cities, including Bologna, Milan, and Naples, have given Zaki honorary citizenship, and Italian universities have written letters to the Egyptian government. In April 2021, the Italian Senate voted to give Zaki Italian citizenship. It was hoped that such citizenship would allow the Italian government more influence over his trial. However, this has not yet been finalized by the foreign minister. Despite this, the Italian government has also been criticized by Italian people for not doing enough to help Zaki. Italy has a strong financial and economic interest in Egypt. In fact, it is the biggest European investor in the country. And it has been suggested that the government doesn't want to harm its relationship with Egypt. On the 9th of December 2021, the researcher was finally released from prison and returned to his family. International pressure succeeded in pushing Egypt to change its approach. However, Zaki is still not in the clear. He still faces charges of harming national security, spreading false news, and incitement to overthrow the state. His trial has been postponed numerous times. As of now, it is scheduled to begin in April 2022. Moreover, his case will be tried in a state security special court. This means that if he is found guilty, he will be unable to appeal the decision. So, is the situation of Patrick Zaki unusual? Or is it common in Egypt and the Middle East? Well, unfortunately, academic freedom and many other freedoms are restricted in most Middle Eastern countries. In fact, on the Academic Freedom Index, Egypt ranks in the lowest group. As I already mentioned, 3 of Zaki's colleagues from EIPR were also jailed in 2020, and the founder of the organization was fined. Other researchers have also been arrested and imprisoned. For example, Ahmed Samir, a student at the Central European University in Vienna, and Kholoud Amar, a translator at the Library of Alexandria. Moreover, human rights groups in France are pushing for the release of Egyptian-Palestinian activist Rami Shaath. I briefly mentioned the case of Guilo Regini earlier, but I think it's important to go into a little bit more detail here. Regini was a PhD student in the UK and was found dead in Cairo in 2016. His body showed clear signs of torture and beatings, and the date that he disappeared was close to the 5-year anniversary of the Egyptian uprising. Guilio had been researching Egyptian labor movements, and human rights groups suggest that he was murdered due to his research. Across the region, academic freedom is generally not respected. For researchers to be able to research, they need to be able to openly and freely discuss topics, including things that governments may not like. For example, the situation of Coptic Christians in Egypt, which displeases the majority Muslim government. However, such freedom annoys and worries governments and regimes across the Middle East. On today's episode of Thinking in English, I tried to introduce the story of Patrick Zaki. Although I'm not an expert, I think it seems relatively clear that he has been unfairly treated and targeted due to his criticism of the Egyptian government. I also think that it is likely he will probably return to prison in the future, unless international pressure makes the Egyptian government change their mind. What do you think? Do you think Zaki should be released and cleared? Is there academic freedom in your country? Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really appreciate every single person who takes the time to listen to my podcast. Make sure you head over to the blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, so you can read the whole transcript of today's episode and look at some of the other content I upload onto the blog. You can also check out my Instagram page. I post very regularly, and if you want to message me, I always reply to people on Instagram. Please leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Leave a rating on Spotify. You can do that now, and I'm trying to get to 150 ratings by the end of February. Please recommend to all of your friends and maybe share on social media. And why not go back and listen to a few of the old episodes? It's one of the best ways to support the podcast. You can also donate on the Thinking in English blog by going to the support page. And yeah, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.